A very warm good afternoon from Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. I would like to thank the members of faculty, non-teaching staff, and students of NSS College. I would also convey my regards to the principal of the institution, Dr. J. Anjana, Mr. Raghunath V, Dr. Jolsna, Mr. Shibu MP, who turns out to be one of my best students, Miss Ramya, Mr. Denny Thomas. Also, I would like to thank my other students, Ms. Padmam, Mr. Shyam Kumar. I would also like to convey my regards and respect to Dr. Sita Vijay Kumar and also to Professor J. Prabhash, who is held in very high esteem in Jawaharlal Nehru University. Finally, I would like to thank God Almighty for making this presentation possible despite several hiccups and glitches. So, as you may know now, the title of the lecture, the way I have titled it, the way I have worded it, is quote, India at 75 could we speak from the standpoint of the marginalized, unquote. Now, the subtitle is a question. Could we speak? So then I think we grapple with a puzzle here, a research puzzle here, which is that when India as a state is committed to social justice, when we probably have the best or at least one of the best constitutions in the world, the Indian Constitution, with its explicit normative thrust on social justice. Why do we raise a question? Could we speak from the standpoint of the marginalized? So I'll try to address some of the issues, and I'll also try to learn from the larger student and the faculty community at NSS College. And of course, there are several related puzzles. There are several related puzzling questions, which is apart from the Constitution, which turns out to be a well-documented treatise on social justice. The other puzzling questions could well be, despite what Professor Atul Kohli would call India as a successful democracy, why are we still talking about could we speak from the standpoint of the marginalized? Probably that is because the subaltern voices, the voices at the margins, are still not adequately represented. They are yet to be coherently articulated. Could they speak? Could the subalterns speak? Do they have the voice? Do they have adequate representation? So I think these are the questions that we would seek to address in this discussion. Again, notwithstanding India's current characterization in international system, or if you want to take the English school seriously, the international society, India is currently characterized as quote-unquote a rising power or an emerging power, or in the world of nuclear politics, a responsible state with advanced nuclear technology, call it whatever you like. Notwithstanding these characterizations, the voices of those who are at the margins, it could be the socially disadvantaged communities, such as scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, other backward classes, the economically deprived, economically exploited sections of society. We could call them the proletariat. Of course, the proletariat have nothing to lose. Or it could be the constituent states of the Indian Union. The constituent states of the Indian Union, it could be Kerala, it could be Tamil Nadu, it could be West Bengal. In a way, these states, the voices of these states, the viewpoints of these states, the perspectives of these governments, they are also getting marginalized. Or it could be the languages which are spoken in India other than Hindi. What about non-Hindi languages? They are also getting subsumed and silenced amidst the cacophony of the mainstream or the dominant narrative. So you have a dominant narrative in place, the mainstream narrative, the orthodox narrative, which is to consider the sovereign state as a rational unitary actor. You don't care actually to get underneath the voices which are in fact vying for articulation. So, and within this dominant narrative, India is characterized as a rising power, as an emerging power, and probably the characterization is apt, the characterization is appropriate. If you go by Kenneth Walls' theory of international politics, you could love Kenneth Walls, you could hate Kenneth Walls, but you cannot ignore Kenneth Walls. Then I think what matters is the relative distribution of capabilities. So I think to an extent, to say that India is a rising power is apt or appropriate. But amidst this mainstream, dominant, orthodox, conventional narrative, which we get to read all the time in newspapers such as the Hindu or the Times of India or the TV news channels, there are voices which are yet to be heard. There are voices which are silenced. There are voices which are ignored. There are voices whose perspectives are completely out of the radar. So I think we would probably focus on those voices for quite normative reasons and also probably for analytical reasons. Now, in this context, the main argument that I'm proposing, and this is a work in progress, is this, which is that as we celebrate, of course, the Constitution Day, I think it's celebrated on the 26th of November every year. There was an article in the Indian Express. I don't know how many of you read the article precisely about Indian Constitution and the marginalized community. But as we celebrate Constitution Day, or as we celebrate Independence Day year after year, or as we celebrate Republic Day year after year, it is not just an occasion or an opportunity to celebrate, but also to introspect. Of course, we could celebrate the uniqueness of the Constitution, the normative thrust of the Constitution, the anchoring of the Constitution on social justice. But it also makes sense to delineate the characteristics, the features of the Indian Constitution, and to unpack the sovereign state. And in this case, of course, India. Generally speaking, in international relations, what has been the rationale of the sovereign state? What are its achievements? Is something fundamentally wrong about the sovereign state, or is everything right about the sovereign state? What about the culpability of the sovereign state in the pandemic crisis? Or as Andrew Linklater would say, what is the moral deficiency of the sovereign state? So in the context of India, what has been the track record or the democratic scorecard of the Indian state? We could go back and recall the words of none other than one of those finest prime ministers India has had, Mr. VP Singh, who would make a point that democracy would mean, democracy would imply, and democracy ought to imply the participation of the people in the decision-making process. Now, along these lines, so let me get straight into the main argument and how we could go about in terms of substantiating this main argument. And the main argument is fairly simple. It's fairly straightforward. It's not convoluted, it's not complicated. And that argument is that the constitutional provisions are necessary, but they are not sufficient. So the constitution per se is not going to guarantee social justice. And that is why you do find a disconnect between, say, for instance, the abolition of untouchability in the Constitution, I mean, the text of the Constitution, and the prevalence or the practice of untouchability, even in the so-called socially progressive states such as Tamil Nadu, for instance. So how do you square the circle? So 3 points for me. I think, how do I make the argument that the the constitutional provisions are not sufficient, they are necessary? I could discern, I could glean, I could tease out three narratives, three perspectives, which are often missing in the mainstream narrative. And the first one is the marginalization of the constituent states of the Indian Union. Now, what kind of a state is India exactly? So we could say that India is a federal state, but maybe it is not apt. You would have political scientists such as Professor Rekha Saxena from Delhi University saying it's actually not federal. It's it's an asymmetrical federalism that you really have. Maybe it is not even asymmetrical federalism, it is quasi-federal. But if you actually get into the practice of the manner in which the central government, what the DMK now calls it as a union, not the center, because center would mean a privileging, right? So India is a union of states. The union is way too privileged to the exclusion of the constituent states of the Indian Union. And that is not how you have federal states in the international system generally. And this actually has implications. It has profound implications. It may have adverse consequences. So, for instance, when Tamil people are suffering in Sri Lanka, what is it that Tamil Nadu as a constituent state do? I mean, to what extent can it do? Because Tamil Nadu as a constituent state has absolutely no role in matters of foreign policy. So this is a clear-cut exclusion. Probably there was a reason, there was a rationale. Probably at the time of Indian independence, it made more sense to ensure that no states became way too autonomous so that they secede from the Indian Union. So one is not questioning that. But I think it's also important to note that the constituent states within the Indian Union, it could be Tamil Nadu, it could be West Bengal, it could be Kerala, they are almost at the periphery, at the margins. It's very much Delhi-centric. It's very much top-down. It's very much hierarchical. And one is not making a point about the current government. This has happened all the time. It has happened during the earlier Congress time, Congress government as well. The invocation of Article 356, the dismissal of state governments, and I think thankfully after the Bombay judgment, the summary dismissal of state governments actually has reduced considerably. I think thanks to the judicial intervention to that extent, and also the commitment of this government to, in a way, to respect the voices of the constituent states. So that's one thing, which is when one is talking about margins or marginalized communities, one gets an impression, or from the analysis, from introspection, from an examination, that constituent states really do not have so much of leeway or maneuverable space to influence policy, especially foreign policy. Now, an interesting point to note is that it also depends on the nature of the issue. Is it a hardcore security issue, which, for instance, the influence, say, of Tamil Nadu in matters of Sri Lanka, then it's a hardcore security issue. Maybe it has to do with national security. And on matters of national security, do find typical national parties, both the Indian National Congress and the BJP, on the same page, a similar worldview. But what about the Tisa River Water Agreement, for instance? So in that case, not so much of a hard security issue. West Bengal could actually articulate its position much more effectively. So between India and Bangladesh, West Bengal had its say. In fact, you had the uh, former foreign minister who is actually quite dynamic, who was dynamic, I think, uh, Mrs. Sushma Swaraj, saying that we could never uh, go to the extent of antagonizing the viewpoint of West Bengal. So I think one can do a two by two matrix, which to an extent I have done in one of my research articles in Third World Quarterly. So that's the first one. The second point is with regard to the languages. Now I'm trying to unpack the Indian Constitution. So rather than uncritically glorifying the text as it is, because you do find in the Constitution, maybe subject to subsequent amendments, the privileging of one language over other languages, the privileging of Hindi. At the heart of the problem is that when you have listed so many languages in the eighth schedule, all languages ought to be made official languages. I think that's a reasonable demand which is being made, for instance, by the DMK government now. The moment you privilege one language over the rest, despite the fact that English could continue as the official link language initially for a period of 15 years, and then you are in fact banking on, trusting on the assurance or the promise given by Jawaharlal Nehru, and that is an indefinite extension. So I think all languages ought to be equally privileged, including English. And I think this whole anti-English argument is, I would say, paving way for another hegemony, paving way for another monopoly, paving way for another dominance. Because English, I think the English language could well be considered as a language of liberation. It could be seen as a vehicle for emancipation from a Dalit perspective or even from a subaltern perspective. It is the English language which, in fact, could be considered as a vehicle for emancipation. I mean, I could be auto-ethnographic on this in a sense that I'm right now in a position to speak to you precisely because of the English language. So one could go back and analyze the speech given by Dr. Manmohan Singh, I think at Oxford, on the mixed impact of the British colonial rule and what was Marx's perspective on the colonial rule. So I think if you go even by Marx's own writings, while Marx would say that the colonial rule brings about misery, and it did, definitely, there is also, I think, a nuance in it, which is the colonial rule in India liberated India from a vegetative state. So minus a colonial rule in India, then I think you need to ask a different question. Would the socially marginalized communities would have ever got access to schools, to colleges, to public spaces? So I think, so there are nuances, and I think it's not way too much into a binary construction. So I think when, even in international relations, when we grapple with questions of West and non-West, global North and global South, I think sometimes we are getting into way too much into a binary construction, which is not helpful. I think a related point on this, I think whoever introduced me made a mention about social exclusion. And on the question of social exclusion is a point about intersectionality. How do you understand social exclusion? So, social exclusion could be along the lines of caste, but it could also be along the lines of class. It could be along the lines of religion. It could be along the lines of language. It could be along the lines of region. It could be along the lines of worldview. In the academic world, sometimes you are penalized. You are not rewarded because you allude to a certain worldview. So there are multiple axes. There are several axes of exclusion as far as social exclusion in India goes. And I think now the reservation given to economically weaker sections, I mean, I think that's a debatable topic. I want to stay away from controversies, but then one could also consider that as a step in the right direction, because you cannot deny the fact that there has been exclusion, and that there has been more of an exclusion owing to globalization in recent times. So, a class based exclusion, economic deprivation, and if the government, in fact, is doing what it is doing, which is to provide a reservation to economically weaker sections of society, I think it makes ample sense. So I think it is to the credit of the current government that economically weaker sections of society are being given reservation. But of course, the technicality as to what should be the income ceiling, how do you figure out who is economically deprived, who is not economically deprived, I think that needs to be worked worked out. Uh, a related point again is that when we discuss emancipation, what is emancipation? Emancipation is liberation. How does Ken Booth, for instance, conceptualize emancipation? It's liberation from physical, political, social, and economic constraints. Now, increasingly, global politics is gearing towards a sectional notion of emancipation, which is to say that this community is a victim and the other community is a perpetrator. So I'm being safe here. So I think rather than go forward in terms of a sectional notion of emancipation, anyone could be a perpetrator, anyone could be a victim. There could be an entrapped community anywhere. It probably makes sense to think of emancipation, to conceptualize emancipation, to theorize emancipation, and to practice emancipation much more holistically, which I think Professor Andrew Linklater, Aberystwyth University, would say the emancipation of the species in his fantastic work Beyond Realism and Marxism. Right. So, I mean, Professor Linklater, interestingly, mounts a critique on Marxism also, because Marxism is way too deterministic. It does not go beyond proletariat. But axis of exclusion is not necessarily along the lines of proletariat only. It could, in fact, be along the lines of gender, class, ethnicity, and so on and so forth. So, emancipation of the species would probably make much more sense in this context. So the first one is about constituent states in terms of center-state relations. The second one in terms of questioning the privileging of Hindi. All languages will have to be equally privileged, and anti-English argument hardly makes sense. As Professor Murthy would say, English, in fact, is very much an Indian language by now. And I think the language of English is considered as a language of progress, a language for liberation, a language for emancipation, and a language for advancement. Now, the third point that I would like to uh, mention and discuss is that rather than blaming the government, or vilifying the sovereign state. It is also important to focus on the commitment of the society. And as we see why the constitutional provisions or the constitutional safeguards are not sufficient, they are necessary, but they are not sufficient. So, what is that gap between that necessary and not sufficient has to do with the lack of commitment of the society. Uh, Mr. Shibu is here. So, you do find, for instance, Robert Cox talking about invoking Gramsci, talking about a state society complex. So it is not merely about vilifying the state, but the state society complex. So rather than to adhere to a very narrow notion of state, if we look at the notion of the state in a more broader sense, it includes society. And I think the term or the concept that is used that makes ample sense is a state society complex. So, what is it in terms of society? What is wrong in terms of society? And here, I think we need to remind ourselves that people do have agency, but there is a tendency then that the more privileged, the more resourceful, the bourgeois, if you would like to call them, they are co opted. And we turn indifferent to systematic violence. The society, as members of society, are we questioning violence on women? Are we questioning violence on scheduled castes, on scheduled tribes? Are we questioning the deprivation of the poor? Are we questioning the exclusion of the elderly? Are we questioning the violence on the non-humans, on the animals, for instance? So there is a tendency to normalize indifference. I mean, in international relations, it happens all the time. A 2-year-old child was killed in the war on Ukraine. So international relations does not care about it because it's in the comfort zone of realism and so on and so forth. So in international relations, people will have to be brought to the forefront. Similarly, when it comes to society, I think we need to question. What we do is we normalize suffering. So suffering. So there is violence here on the poor. There is violence there on women. There is violence here on the elderly population. There is exclusion happening all the time. What Oliver Richmond would say, everyday suffering. So this everyday suffering has to be brought to an end. At least it has to be minimized. So otherwise, what happens is indifference to injustice is tantamount to violence. So it is not just about violence, but even if you are indifferent to violence, then that could in fact would amount to violence. I mean, I think internationally speaking, the genocide in Rwanda between April and June 1994, when probably about 500,000 to 800,000 people were killed in a matter of 100 days, the fastest rate of human killing in world history. The international community virtually did nothing. The United Nations, I think Mr. Shah must have spoken about United Nations. At the peak of the genocide in Rwanda, the United Nations troop contingent was reduced from 2,700 to 270. This is the international community that we are talking about. War in Ukraine, and there is an utter indifference. The fourth and final Elam war in Sri Lanka, attack on hospitals, attack on children, attack on women, again indifference, even by the neighbors of Sri Lanka. So I think there is a pressing need, there is a pressing normative necessity to question violence. And I think it is in this context that, theoretically speaking, we need to change the system as it does exist now. Now, one of the differences between, or probably the most important difference between problem-solving theory and critical theory generally, is that when we are in the realm of problem solving theory, we are trying to make changes. But we are making incremental changes. We are making cosmetic changes which are within the system, right? Within the system, we make some changes. For instance, even Mahatma Gandhi, for instance, could be considered as someone who is trying to make a change within the social system, within the social order. And that is why Gandhi was not supporting the separate electorates that Ambedkar supported. But sometimes making changes within the system to make incremental modifications within the system may not be sufficient. You need to transform the system. To quote Marx again, quote, philosophers interpret the world in many ways, but the point, however, is to change it, unquote. Because why? I mean, critical theorists would say it is not just about change in the system or change within the system. It is actually change of the system. The very system has to be transformed. The very system has to be changed. It has to be modified. It can no longer be an unjust system, which is unfavorable to the proletariat, to women, to socially marginalized. And for instance, Ambedkar, his work, Annihilation of Caste, is a treatise on social justice. But do we really articulate Ambedkar's work internationally? Does India articulate its commitment to social justice internationally, to the global world? Right? So for Ambedkar, the caste system has to be destroyed. It has to be annihilated, and therefore annihilation of caste. Because Dr. Ambedkar was not theorizing from the air-conditioned rooms of universities. I mean, whatever Dr. Ambedkar speaks about is from his experience. The best thing about annihilation of caste is that it was a lecture which Dr. Ambedkar was prevented from delivering. He could not even deliver the lecture. And therefore, because he was prevented from delivering the lecture, he had to print copies and circulate and distribute. Right? So Dr. B.R. Ambedkar makes a case for annihilating the caste system. As long as the social order is in operation, justice is impossible. So annihilate the system, transform the social order. So, and here I think what is important is you do find several thinkers, social and political thinkers, several practitioners maybe, having different world views, different perspectives. It could be Mahatma Gandhi, and I think Mahatma Gandhi's worldview is as valid, as legitimate as anyone else's. The best thing about Gandhi is that he practiced what he preached, a stunning simplicity. It is not about saying one thing and doing something entirely different. So, but for Gandhi, I think the difference that we need to understand is, I mean, the Gandhi-Ambedkar debate, in the words of probably the best writer, Arundhati Roy, in Annihilation of Caste, the Doctor and the Saint. I don't know how many of you have read it. And this is the difference. So you may have Mahatma Gandhi making a point, which is to bring changes within the social order. And that is why he does not make a case, he does not support separate electorates. But you do find Ambedkar not being satisfied with this. He did, in fact, support separate electorates. And I think the British rule was sympathetic to that idea. But because of Pune Pact and the rest of it, and I think Gandhi fasted, and it has to be dropped. So I think questions of equality, empowerment, and emancipation would come to the fore if we tend to transform the social order. And there are any number of political and social thinkers. It is not just about Gandhi or Ambedkar. It could be Periyar, EVR, Mr. C.N. Annadurai, Mr. M. Karunanidhi, and now, of course, we have Mr. M.K. Stalin, the luminaries of the Dravida movement, who, in fact, make a case for transforming the social order, for modifying the social order. And the resistance The historical resistance to imposition of Hindi since 1938 needs to be seen in that light. It is not just resisting the imposition of language, it is resisting the onslaught of a certain social order, uh, which normalizes, which justifies hierarchy, oppression, exclusion, and so on and so forth. So, and you have others thinkers, other scholars. It could be Narayana Guru in Kerala, Rabindranath Tagore in West Bengal, Ram Manohar Lohia, uh, I think across the country, and I think we may agree to disagree, but I think it is important that in the spirit of plurality, in the spirit of multiplicity, in the spirit of variety, in the spirit of diversity, that we engage with different perspectives. We may not agree with all these perspectives, but at least on board, let's take all these perspectives. The robustness of India does not lie in its singularity. India is not about one religion, one language, whatever. I think India is much more plural, much more multiplistic. The robustness of India lies in its diversity. And I think the notion of emancipation, which of course flows from the Western world, it could be Ken Booth, it could be the Frankfurt School, it could be Professor Andrew Linklater, but I think it's now nuanced, it's getting modified, it's implemented, it's internalized in India in terms of notions, in terms of understandings, in terms of perspectives. Let me end with what the current Chief Minister of Tamil Nadu says uh, in Tamil, of course. I don't know how many of you could appreciate. He says, quote, Ellorukum ellam, unquote, so which would mean everything for everyone, unquote. So that's the notion of emancipation that we need to look forward to achieving, that no one is excluded. No community is excluded, no individual is excluded, not even the non-humans are excluded. And that is what we should aspire for, which is the emancipation of the species, everything for everyone. Thank you so much.